What's up YouTube? In this video you are going to learn about the OnClick event and you're going to understand how it works under the hood, because it's the event, for example, that is triggered once you click on a button, and we're going to look at that in C# and WPF. In order to understand these events, we need to put ourselves in the shoes of the developers who built them so that we can now consume them, and therefore we need to look into delegates first. But before we do that, I would really appreciate if you hit that like button and also subscribe if you haven't subscribed already. And now let's look at delegates before we build a quick WPF example. So what is a delegate? Well, in simple terms, a delegate is a type that can hold a reference to a method. And when you call the delegate, then the method referenced will get called. Now we're ready to understand how click events actually work. So imagine we're developing a UI library that other developers can use to build mobile apps. And one of the UI elements that other developers can use, for example drag and drop, is a button. If we look at the code behind the button class used to create the green button on the screen, we can see a button like this will have the following properties: a string called text with the value sent, a color called backColor, which is somewhat greenish, and of course two ints called sizeW and sizeH for the width and height of the button. Now what is missing here is the method that contains the code that needs to be executed once the button is clicked. Now we have a problem here. We, as the developers who made this UI system, cannot tell what the other developers using the UI system want the button to do when it's clicked. That's why we need to provide the OnClick event as a delegate and not as a normal method. And since a delegate is a variable that can store a reference to a method, other developers can write their own implementation inside a method that contains the logic they want to be executed on click and assign it to the button's OnClick delegate or event we provided. Our OnClick delegate can be defined like this. And now let's break it down bit by bit. So we will start by writing the access specifier, followed by the delegate keyword, which tells the compiler that we are defining a new delegate type. And finally, we need to specify the type of methods our delegate can store. And by type, I mean the return type and the parameters. OnClick delegate, which is the name of the delegate we just defined. So now that next step is to actually create a variable of the new delegate type. So we define it just like we define any variable in C#, by starting with the public keyword, then the type of the variable we are creating, which is the OnClick delegate, and lastly the variable name, which is OnClick. So how can the other developers use this new delegate to execute their own code? So let's say the other developers dragged and dropped a button into the canvas in the IDE they are using to develop this mobile app using our UI system, which resulted in a creation of a button object. Let's assume the name of this button is sendButton. First, they will have to add the logic they want to execute when the button is clicked. Let's say they want to connect to the network, send a message, then display a message to the user whenever the button is clicked. So now they have a method called sendButtonClick that is not yet connected to the button in any way. To fix that, they need to assign their method to our OnClick delegate that belongs to the button object. Note, we wrote our method name without the brackets because we're not calling it, we are just storing its reference in the OnClick delegate. Now under the hood in our UI system, if the mouse was hovering over the button and the mouse was clicked, our UI system will call the OnClick delegate of our sendButton, which will in return call any methods that were assigned to it. In this case, it will call the sendButtonClick and the message send dialog will be displayed. This way, whoever uses our UI system can create their own methods, then assign their methods to our delegates, and we can call them whenever the conditions are met. We are not limited to OnClick events. We can even create delegates for when the application starts or closes, for example. This was a very abstract example, but this is a real use case of delegates in general. So now let's see this process in action using WPF. Therefore, let's create a new project, and here I'm going to use C# WPF, and I'm going to call this one OnClick Event Demo. And now that the window is loaded, let's try to replicate our previous example. So let's first add a button and change its text to sent and its color to something greenish. Therefore, I'm just going to use the grid down here and just add a button in. So if you don't know what I'm doing here, then you should check out my video on WPF. Basically, I'm creating inside of this grid a little button that will have a width of 136 pixels, a height of 49, a background of this greenish color, font size of 22, and we have this button click event once we click on it. So this is the example file, and then we have the code behind file in which we now need to create this click event. So this button click method that will then be called, because currently if we would run the code and click on it, our code would crash because there is no method in the code behind that takes care of the click event. Quick pause. In this video, you'll learn something about C#. And if you want to learn everything there is to know that you need for the fundamentals and to become a real C# developer, then definitely check out my C# masterclass, in which you're going to learn all of the things you need to know about C#. So you're going to learn how to do the basics, how to use object-oriented programming, how to use WPF in order to create your own user interfaces, how to use databases, how to use LINQ, how to create your own games using Unity, and a lot more. So if you want to become a real C# developer, definitely check out the link in the description below. So now let's go into the code behind and actually set it up. So I'm going to create a public method that is going to take care of this click event. I'm going to call this one button click, which has to be exactly written like it was here. So you can copy it from here and make sure that you have the exact same name. Now, if you want to take care of a button click, you need to pass an object sender and rooted event args that I'm going to call E, which is pretty much the default. So here, inside of those brackets, that's where I can now define what should happen once we click on the button. And I'm just going to use a message box here, which is going to be a little pop-up that will appear. And I'm going to show a text that will say message was sent. All right, so that's going to be pretty much it. That is what our button should do. Now let's test this application. Let's run it real quick, and we will see that our application pops up. We click on the send button and it says message was sent. Okay, so that seems to work. But what is happening in the background? Well, we never assigned our button click method to any delegate. If we check out this button click, you see now I have a reference here. Before that I didn't have it. I had to actively search for it. Well, right click and find all reference here. And the thing is, we never called this method ourselves, right? But if you look at the references, you will find that this button has in fact a reference. So it is used here for system Windows control button target click, and here it adds the rooted event handler, this button click. So let's click on that, and you will find that inside of your main window GICS, it is actually referencing our method here. So here we see that there is an object called a target, which is this one here, which is being casted into a button object. So here, this is the button object. This is just system Windows controls.button. Basically, this is the path where the button class exists. So it converts this target into a button, and then it has this click. So here you see this bolt. This is basically the sign for it being an event, and we're assigning something to it, which in particular is a rooted event handler, which uses our button click. So it's using our button click method to be precise. And it assigns it to this click, which is an event. And it is of type rooted event handler. Now, rooted event handler itself is a delegate. Okay, and this is how everything comes together. So if you look at this, it is a public delegate that doesn't return anything, and it, well, requires a sender and rooted event args. So if you look at our method here, our button click method, now you might understand why we needed to add this, because otherwise, why would we even do that? Why would we add object sender into rooted event arcs? We're never using them, right? Well, we can use them, and sometimes we even have to use them depending on the application that we're building. But in general, we just need to follow this structure because that is how this delegate has been designed. So this delegate tells us, hey, if you want to use me, or if you want to build an event that will use me, then you need to follow my structure, which means you need to return nothing, and you need to have the declaration that I have with the parameters. Okay, so we return nothing, and we have those parameters. So this is a very simple line of code, but there's a lot going on here, right? Because then this delegate itself is used. Let's go back to this reference here. It's used for this event, okay? Because basically we're creating an event of our rooted event handler, which is this delegate, and there we can assign multiple methods to. And there we can now assign multiple methods that follow the delegate format. So here, that's why we just see the plus equal sign. So here it says plus equal. And by the way, if you were wondering how I get to all of this, well, you can hold the control key and then you get to the declaration of it. So here I'm clicking on the rooted event handler, and this sends me to the declaration of this delegate. So you might wonder, what is this event thingy and why is it used here? And why doesn't it use just the delegate keyword? Well, let's look at that in a presentation real quick. Okay, so let's look at events versus delegates. So an event is a restricted form of a delegate, forced to behave like a list, which means we can either subscribe or unsubscribe. So using the plus equal in order to subscribe, or the minus equal in order to unsubscribe. Also, events can't be put on the left side of the equal sign alone. So you cannot just assign one thing to an event. You always have to just add or subtract from an event. A delegate allows a direct assignment, however. So via my delegate equals my method, as we have seen before. Doing so replaces whatever other methods had been added to it before. That's also something you have to take into consideration. Also, events can only be invoked by the class that defines them. So from outside their class, you can only register or unregister methods to or from them. This will protect our events from being invoked without our permission, or when the conditions for firing the events are not yet met. Since our delegates must be marked as public so that others can subscribe or unsubscribe to them, the event keyword will make sure that it can only be called from inside the button class itself. All right, so I hope this gave you a little bit of an idea of how events and delegates are working together in order, for example, to allow us to use this on button click. So it is something that is rather complicated. So there's a lot going on in the background. So you should understand delegates in more depth if you are struggling with what you saw in this video. And I will upload another video on delegates in the near future. So definitely check that one out if this was going over your head. All right, so if you enjoyed this video, then please hit that like button and also hit that subscribe button if you haven't done so already, in order to not miss out, for example, on the delegates video that we're going to upload very soon. So thanks a lot for watching the video, and I hope to see you in the next one.